Okay, so I want to talk to you today about glazing. There will be an informational handout at your table you can refer back to as you are glazing. So the first thing, you need to grab your supplies from your supply list. So you need to work on newspaper. You'll want to wear an apron. You'll need your clay project, different sizes of paint brushes. You would need a container of water to rinse. Again, you don't need to fill it full, fill it halfway. You're only going to take one container of glaze at a time. So a couple of rules to go over before we start. Absolutely no eating or drinking. You do not want to get glaze in your mouth. Glaze is a special paint for clay that has powdered chemicals in it. So we don't want to leave it on our hands, and we don't want to accidentally get it in our mouth or eat it or drink it or any of that. It's just not safe to do. Some glazes are toxic. I try to work with non-toxic glazes, but it's a good practice and good habit to get into. This also includes no gum. So if you have gum, you want to spit it out before you start to glaze. You want to make sure to wash your ceramic piece in your hands, especially if you've put lotion on your hands. You want to wash your hands with soap and water before you start to glaze. If you don't, what happens is sometimes you get areas where the glaze won't stick. Another rule, you do not want to put any glaze on the bottom of your project. It will stick when it fires through the kiln. If for some reason you do happen to get glaze on the bottom of your project, you're going to just take a sponge, a wet sponge, and wipe it off. And you'll notice the glaze comes right off the bottom of the project. If you do, what happens, it acts like a glue and it sticks to the kiln shelf, and the only way for me to get your project out is to actually break it with a hammer, and I don't want to do that. You want to use one color of glaze at a time. You'll notice I have them in these little containers. Sometimes the lids fit better than others depending on how I've ordered them. So when you carry them, please carry it like this. Glaze is a more expensive art supply that we work with, so we want to make sure that we're not wasting it and we're only going to add one color of glaze at a time, and you want 2 to 3 layers of each color of glaze. Don't apply glaze to an area that already has glaze unless it is a clear glaze, or if you do, be aware that it might not mix the way that you expect. So this project here shows a good example of that. Here they painted a pink glaze, and then the student went and put black dots over the top, and you can see it was fine. Here the student painted a black glaze and tried to do pink dots over it, and you can see some of them are really difficult to see. Same thing down here, you can see I used a teal glaze and then tried to put pink over it, and it didn't show up. Because glaze has a chemical reaction in the kiln, we can't always anticipate how the glazes are going to interact when we layer them. What I have found works fairly well is if you are going to layer them, do the lightest layer on the bottom and then do the darker layer on top, and then it's more likely to come out. Apply glaze like you would if you were painting. One thing I want you to consider, think about what size brush works best for the details that you're doing. So like here, I'm doing some of these smaller details, you would want to have a smaller brush, but when you have larger areas like here, you could work with a larger brush. Rinse off your paintbrush when you're done with a color, so that's why you have the water. You'll rinse it and then you can pick a different color. Make sure that you don't glaze so thick that it's globby and so thin that you see the white of the pot. Try to limit your colors, try and repeat your colors to create unity throughout your project. Here they did a great job of repeating the red here and on the flower and on the top, but they only used the yellow once. So one way they could help create unity in their project was by painting this yellow, or putting yellow dots in the design, or making the inside of the project yellow, or the bottom of the lid yellow. So the more times that you can repeat a color, it can help it really have unity. At the end, you need to add 1 to 2 layers of clear glaze to your pottery to help make all your colors shiny and to seal any gaps. Don't forget, if you plan to eat or drink from your mug, you need to glaze the inside of your mug as well. And then make sure to wash your hands to remove any glaze after cleanup. Okay, so when you glaze, you're glazing a big area, you could use a bigger brush and you just apply it like you would paint. Don't glaze your entire project one color. What happens then is we lose all the details in your project. So like right here, if I just glazed it this way, you might lose the carved details that I have on the back of the owl here. And you'll notice one thing about this with the glaze, it's drying very quickly. So I almost have 1 layer in this area, and I would continue on around to the other side. Now I want you to think about what color this looks like. You might have said purple or pink. This color that's going on is actually this dark blue. So in the cups, a lot of times companies are now starting to tint them to make them look similar to the color, but it's not going to be exact. In fact, we have a chart up against the wall that you can look at that will show you the different glaze colors, what they turn out to be. So let's go take a look at that. See over here by the sinks, we have a glaze chart. So the blue that I was talking about, this is what it'll look like once it's fired, because the powdered chemicals in the glaze actually go through a chemical reaction in the kiln, and that's what takes it from this color to the royal blue color. When you are getting your glaze, you'll notice that I have them set up by color at the table by the sink. The color of paper that they're on is just to help us be organized. It has nothing to do with the color that it's going to come out. So that's when you're going to want to look at the glaze chart. You'll notice that some of them up here say by request only. The reason for that, we have limited amounts of that color. So just ask and I will check to see what we have in stock. Okay, so I've added one layer here. You'll remember, if you think back to our glazing handout, it said that we need 2 to 3 of each color. So I would take my brush and I would start a second coat of glaze. So that's what I mean by 2 to 3 layers of a color. You go back over that same area 2 or 3 times. That's what helps your color turn out most true. Sometimes if you only do 1 layer, it's too thin and it'll end up light or spotty. So it helps to have multiple layers. Now, one thing I want to point out, when you're glazing something that's 3-dimensional, you have to be careful. So if I didn't want the wings here to be blue, all of a sudden now they are going to be blue because I got blue along there. So one of the techniques that you might think about when you're glazing is that you might take a small brush and go around the edges of the area that you're glazing with a color. So that way, when you glaze close to it, you won't get that color on there, because now that that blue is there, it's going to remain there. Even if I took like a clean brush or a sponge and I went over it, I could make it lighter, but there's still going to be kind of a hint of a color unless I went over it with a much darker color. So that's something to be careful of. Really try and have a controlled technique. I want to make sure I don't have a lot of water in my brush when I'm glazing, so after I rinse it, I dry it off on a paper towel. So I could take an outline here and then the same thing right along this edge. If I didn't want it to have the color in this section, I could take my small brush, outline around there, and then I could come back in with like a medium-sized brush and fill in the other areas a lot more quickly without having to worry about getting that into those areas. Now, if you're wanting to do something with some small details, you want to make sure you don't have too much glaze on your brush. You want to make sure you have a small brush. So like here, if I wanted these details to stand out, I would just work really slowly and carefully with the small brush to go over those. You want to be careful when you are glazing that you help those details stand out. So like these character details from this student's project wouldn't have stood out as much. Here she carved in her name, and when we're up close we can see it, but if I was holding this in the back of the classroom, you would have a much harder time noticing this detail. So make sure, like here, the student did a great job of going over their design with glaze to help it stand out. So when you are finished with your glazing, the last thing that I ask is that you seal it with some clear. So we're going to pretend that this thing is completely done, ready to be fired. There will be some cups. I haven't taken the time to mark them clear, but one thing I want you to notice about the clear is that a lot of times it has been tinted or given a color. Now this has been sitting a while. If you see that the glaze is kind of separated, you might take a moment to stir it and get it all mixed back up together. And then I wipe off the extra so I don't have a ton on my brush. And then for the clear, I would just start to put it on over the top. Now notice I'm glazing where it's completely dry. What you're going to notice when this clear dries, it's going to give my project a blue look. Now the reason I'm asking you to do clear, it helps to seal your project. I would glaze the entire thing, the inside, the top rim. I would not want to glaze the bottom of my project because remember that would stick in the kiln. It does help to seal any cracks and creases and crevices to make sure that your pottery is protected. Another thing you can do, like here, this actually isn't white glaze, this is just the white of the pottery, but you'll notice that it's shiny, and that's because it has been sealed with clear glaze. You don't actually have to glaze white glaze. I do have a white glaze by request if you need it, but just using the clear glaze is usually enough to do that as well. And then when you're finished with your project, the first thing I would do is check the bottom of it once it's all glazed, wipe it off, make sure there's no glaze on the bottom. I'm going to take my glaze, put the lid back on. I'm going to take my paint brushes that are in the water, I'm going to take them back over to the sink. I'll wash out my brushes really well, and then remember we put these away bristle side up so that the bristles don't dry like they're smushed. And then the glaze, really be careful, put it back on the correct spot. I will try and get these labeled so you can see. But this is dark blue, this is clear, because if you mix this up and put it on the wrong spot, someone's going to grab it thinking it's light blue or it's purple, and they'll be really disappointed in how their project turns out. So you'll take these back over the table, put them on the correct color, your newspaper gets thrown away, and then your project will go on the blue cart in the back of the room to go through the firing process again. Please let me know if you have any questions, and good luck with glazing.